Hi, my name is James Shepard, and one thing that my wife Christina would tell you about me is that I take great pride in reading really, really boring stuff because I feel like nobody else is reading this, and so I can get an edge. I can learn something that nobody else is willing to learn. This last week, that took the shape of reading a 52-page opinion by Justice Thomas from the Supreme Court in this Ohio v. American Express case. And it was really, really interesting. I learned some things about our industry, how the Supreme Court views the merchant services industry, and even what I think the future of cash discounting will be, which was very interesting. So I just want to share a little bit of that. So a couple things that really stood out to me about this case and about the way the Supreme Court looks at our industry, and in this case in particular. So this case, first of all, to kind of set the stage, American Express has anti-steering laws. And the anti-steering laws mean if I'm a merchant and I decide to take American Express, I'm not allowed to steer a customer away from American Express at the counter and, put a sign up that says something like, we prefer Visa and MasterCard, something like that. Because the idea is, hey, American Express has done all this work to get their customers into your store. Once they're there, you can't steer them to Visa or MasterCard. Well, the state of Ohio sued American Express and said basically that is an anti-competitive practice. If a merchant wants to steer you to a different card, that's up to the merchant. That's you can't make an anti-steering law. And long story short is that the Supreme Court sided with American Express, and they said, no, that's fine. You can have that anti-steering law in there. Now, the reason that they sided with American Express is very interesting for our industry. The first reason they sided with American Express is because all of this anti-competitive stuff comes from the Sherman Act of like 1930 or somewhere around there. They had the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so that's when they broke up, things like Standard Oil and the old big companies. And so what they said basically was, yes, you could say that's anti-competitive if you're looking at it from a perspective of a one-sided market, meaning it is potentially anti-competitive for the merchant. But this is a two-sided market. It's transactional. So you have merchants and you have consumers. And if you want to prove that somebody is being anti-competitive in the payments industry, you have to prove that what their anti-competitive behavior is hurting the consumer and the merchant. Well, that's impossible, really practically speaking. I mean, think about it. If Visa goes out and raises interchange by a percentage point, but at the same time they increase rewards to their customers, then that's not anti-competitive because it benefited the consumer. It just sucks for the merchant. So the idea behind it is basically this. In a two-sided market, you have something called negative feedback loops. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but it was kind of interesting because I had actually just gotten done reading a book called The Platform Revolution, which talks about network effects. And so the idea behind it was basically there's no way you're going to prove somebody's anti-competitive. And so, reading the whole thing, if I could summarize it all into one sentence, the Supreme Court has no interest in regulating or constricting the payment processing industry. That's pretty much it. It was a 5-4 ruling. It's not like it was unanimous, but it was 5-4 along party lines. All the conservative judges voted, in favor of these provisions, and the more liberal judges went against. Well, as you all know, Justice Kennedy just resigned, and so he's going to be replaced by, at least a somewhat conservative judge who knows exactly who Trump will, put up here and who will get confirmed. But it's going to, be a conservative judge. So the idea of the judges, the court's probably not going to change their opinion on this very much at all over the next 10 years. So that was really interesting. The other really interesting thing about it was cash discounting, right? So I was like, it was funny because it kind of went both ways for me. I was really playing it out of my mind of like, okay, if I was a lawyer for Visa and MasterCard right now, they don't like cash discounting. They don't like surcharging really. If I was a lawyer, what would I do? Well, one thing I would want to do is I'd want to file something and say, hey, wait a second. You just said that our anti-steering provisions were unconstitutional because, the courts just ruled and said Visa and MasterCard have these anti-steering rules that say you can't steer somebody away from your cards towards cash or anything else by doing a surcharge or anything like that. And Visa lost. So if I was them, I'd be like, well, wait a second, here we go. Well, you would think that, but there's two huge problems here that came up with it. Number one, American Express has always allowed cash discounting. And it's funny because Justice Thomas, one of the ways in his, they call it the majority opinion, one of the ways he justified the ruling was he said these anti-steering provisions, they do not keep the merchant from steering a customer towards checks, debit or cash. You can look at the blog article for the exact quote, but he literally, invoked cash discounting in the majority opinion and said, we're glad that American Express allows that, and because of that, this is legitimate. So they really legitimized cash discounting because of that kind of one little miniature paragraph they had about it. And so that was really interesting. And the other thing is, there's now been this law, the Durbin Amendment, that was part of the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act that almost got repealed, but it didn't. And so now that Durbin Amendment says that no law can be created that keeps a merchant from offering a discount to pay with cash. So it's pretty tough at this point as a Visa, MasterCard. If I was their attorney and I'm trying to figure out how are we going to get around this, how are we going to go after cash discounting? Well, you can go after state laws, but that's going to take a long time. You could certainly sue other companies and say, well, we can sue, this big back-end processor acquirer because they're misusing the surcharge laws. And you could do that, but if it gets all the way to the Supreme Court, it doesn't look like that's going to break in their favor. It looks like it's going to give merchants even more ability to do whatever they want with the steering towards cash. So very interesting opinion. I'll be interested to see how it goes. Right now, I think cash discounting is going to be around for a long time based on what I just saw. And I think the biggest threat to our industry is going to come much more from fintech, entrepreneurs, people that are going to disrupt the industry by cutting out the middlemen. It's not going to come because Congress makes some new regulation or because the Supreme Court has some landmark ruling that messes everything up. So that's my thought. My name is James Shepard. Hopefully you enjoyed this little update. Have a great week.